As you probably recall in the last video from my making of series for Western Princess Peach, things did not go as well as I had hoped, and it was a very large hit to my confidence. So it seemed that the best option to go forward was to start with something very simple and very straightforward to build my confidence back up in myself. You may note that over the course of these videos there's going to be a lot of scenery changes, and that is because most of these videos were filmed either right before, right after, or during the process of me moving from my previous city to my current city. I start a grad school program this coming fall, and that will be taking up a lot of my time, so I was really trying to crank out as much of this cosplay as I could before we got to that point. I thoroughly believe that the new place that we're living at, which you see around me right now, is a much better option, and the lighting is going to be better, the quality of the cosplays I will be making is going to be a lot better, and just in general it's definitely an upgrade. So I'm excited to show you all of that as well. If you're interested, I can also give you a tour of my new cosplay room. I was able to paint the walls, which was very exciting for me, and get some new furniture for it, and I'm feeling much more at home and much more creative in the space.
To start out, I'm assembling my patterns from Truly Victorian, a site you'll most likely see again and again as I am a huge fan of e-patterns. You basically just print out your pattern in sections and tape them together to get the final product. Here you can see I'm experimenting with what would be the most efficient way to cut off the edges. This is honestly the biggest downside of the process, but I just got a paper trimmer in the mail, so hopefully it'll be way easier on my hands going forward. Once you cut them all up, you tape them together and you end up with a massive sheet with all of your patterns on them, like so. These pieces were all cut out of a handkerchief weight linen from Fabric-Store, which so far has been a pretty reasonable and reliable place to get linen from. Now I'm just going through and sewing up the main seams of the chemise here with a quick little stop to reinforce half the straps on the top for buttonholes, as the pattern calls for. I picked this chemise in particular because I could unbutton the straps to hide them on my off-the-shoulder bodice. Otherwise, this pattern is very basic. I don't want to waste everyone's time by describing the sewing of straight lines and lace application, so please accept a montage instead. Quick interlude to thread ribbon through the insertion lace so the neckline can be cinched up, and then back to sewing lace to the armholes. fuss with the buttonhole foot a little bit, and the chemise is just about done. On to the drawers. Now that most of the body of the drawers has been sewn up, the waistband is attached. Unlike modern straight waistbands, these waistbands were curved to fit the body. So as I ironed, I clipped the seam for a smoother shape. After I finished the main body of the drawers, I set out to finish the cuffs, starting with the terminating leg ruffle. Hemming is always a massive pain in the butt for me, so I try to spend a little bit extra time ironing everything down well beforehand to prevent me from having to MMA style fight my machine. The ruffle is gathered and attached to the cuff, then the leg of the drawers is gathered down to the cuff and attached as well. And they're done! With all that done, it's time to start on what I thought was going to be a much more difficult project than it ended up being. To start the hoop skirt, I worked off of a corselet pattern from Truly Victorian for the waistband. The original waistband was a simple belt, however, I have perpetual back problems, and anything that cinches a great deal of pressure on the small of my back is a big no-go for me. By making the waistband a wider lace-up, I redistributed the pressure along a greater area. I used the same style of assembly for this as I did for my base corset. If you're interested in that process, check out my first 2 videos from this series on the making of my corset. Since this garment isn't really meant to cinch me in at all, I didn't need the same strength layers as a real corset, so this one was made out of some lightweight white cotton and bound with some store-bought bias tape. It was boned with heavy-duty zip ties, which are a popular alternative to metal or synthetic baleen boning in the costume community, and finished with hand-done eyelets. Next, strips were marked according to the pattern to indicate where the tunnels for the boning would sit. Before sewing, the edges are melted with a candle to prevent fraying. The ribbons are then doubled up and sewn down along the lines to create channels. The bag of the hoop skirt gets cut out and assembled next. This is basically just a very large, slightly shaped rectangle with channels sewn into it attached at the bottom. By keeping it solid at the hem, it prevents you from tripping on the channels or ribbons. Then it was time to cut and cap the wire. I picked up hoop wire from Truly Victorian at the same time I bought my patterns for ease. Hoop wire is thicker and able to handle more weight than corset wire. We didn't have fancy wire cutters, so it took a bit of elbow grease to get these things cut to size. Once all of the wires had been cut, they needed to be capped. Cut wire is very pointy and sharp and can't be left as is. If you have a Dremel or an angle grinder, you could probably grind down the edges, but that seemed scary, so I went with the more accessible option, wire caps. These are essentially rounded caps that slip over the edge of the wire and then get crimped down. Apparently some people are able to do this alone, but I don't know how. Sean and I had to apply pressure both horizontally and vertically to get them to actually close down on the wires and stay. Once all of the hardware had been prepped, all that was left was assembly. The wires were sewn by hand to the bag hem and then laid on the floor oriented the same direction as the waist on the mannequin. I then attached the ribbons one by one on the dress form to keep them from getting tangled or twisted during attachment. I'm a very visual thinker, so seeing them laid out helped me visualize the process. They were then hand sewn onto the back side of the waistband. With all of the ribbons securely attached, the last step was to cut out the boning channels and insert the wires. These boning channels were cut along the measurements described in the directions, but oddly enough they didn't close all the way when the wires were inserted. I am unsure if this is a design flaw or something that went wrong with my specific process. It's not a massive hindrance, however, so I let it be. Once they were all in, it was time to try it all on.
My scandalous under things are now complete and ready to go. I think this was the project that I definitely needed to get my confidence back, and I'm glad I did it instead of just buying one or cheaping out and wearing a shirt. I really enjoyed working with this pattern. It was very simple, very straightforward to follow. I enjoy it. It's a little odd wearing the split drawers because they're so unlike anything that I'm used to, but they're fun in their own way. One thing I learned during this process, I think I'm allergic to linen. Every time I started cutting or working with raw edges or anything where little bits of linen fiber could fluff up into the air, I had the worst runny nose. And not stuffed up either, just running and running. Very gross, I know. But it was a lot. I had to keep a roll of toilet paper next to me to make sure that I could blot my nose as necessary. It seems that once the edges are closed up and I'm not manipulating the fiber in a way that causes any of it to come off, then it's fine. I don't, get any allergies or hives or anything from wearing the clothes. I'm doing fine in this. It's slightly rough, but that will soften over time. That's just kind of the nature of linen. But the runny nose is a massive pain in the butt, and I am not a fan of it. If any of you guys have ever had any issues like this, let me know. It seems to only happen with linen fabric. I don't get it with polyesters or cottons or rayons or anything like that. But luckily, it's dealt with. It's fine. I think I get it a little bit with the pink fabric I'm using for the outer skirt and bodice because that's a cotton linen blend, but because it's a blend, it's not nearly as intense. But overall, I know that underwear is not the most interesting kind of video, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed coming back on this journey with me, and I'm looking forward to moving on to the next steps in the